The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as 5-year-old Kalen Rouet stood before 6 of the state's most dangerous felons. His small, pale hands trembled against the oversized hem of his gray t-shirt, his eyes wide and vacant, the look of a child who hadn't uttered a single sound since the night he watched his mother's life slip away 18 months ago. Standing behind the high mahogany bench, Judge Seraphine Holt issued an order that made the gallery gasp in collective horror. She wasn't sending Kalen to a foster home or a pristine ward. She was handing him over to the Monster House, a 90-day experimental rehabilitation program where these 6 convicts would be his only protectors. The public saw a radical judicial experiment. The media saw a death sentence for an innocent boy. But as Seraphine's hand tightened around her gavel, her knuckles turning white, she looked at Kalen with a desperation no one understood. What the world didn't know, what would ruin her career and shatter the city's legal foundation, was that this wasn't just a case. Kalen was her own grandson. And she had gathered these monsters, not to reform them, but to use their lethal instincts to smoke out the high-ranking killer the police were protecting. Among the line of orange jumpsuits stood Malric Vane, a man whose name was whispered in the yard like a curse. A death row inmate with a hulking frame and eyes that looked like they had already seen the end of the world. The prosecutor called him a heartless butcher. The headlines called him the devil of Cell Block C. But as the other 5 convicts stood rigid, projecting strength or calculated pity, Kalen's gaze drifted. He walked past the art forger with the charming smile. He bypassed the legal genius who had already mapped out a way to use the boy for a plea deal. He stopped directly in front of Malric. In a room filled with the most powerful legal minds in the country, the silent boy reached out and climbed into the lap of the man scheduled for execution. He pressed his face into the rough orange fabric of Malric's chest, took a shaky breath, and whispered the first word anyone had heard from him in nearly 2 years. That single word didn't just break the silence. It declared war on the corrupt system that had framed an innocent man and left a killer on the streets. This is the story of how a child who lost everything found a family in a house of shadows, and how the man the world called a monster became the only hero capable of bringing the truth to light. If you're ready to see how these outcasts take on the city's most powerful villains to protect one little boy, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single second of the evidence hidden in a child's drawings. 14 days earlier, Judge Seraphine Holt had sat in her private chambers, staring at the file of Detective Dorian Strake, the man whose perfect arrest record was built on a foundation of planted evidence and broken lives. She knew the truth about Malric Vane, the former teacher who had been silenced because he knew too much. She knew that to save her grandson, she couldn't rely on the law. She had to rely on the lawless. The steel gates of the Redgate Manor didn't creak. They hummed with a heavy hydraulic finality that echoed across the rain-slicked driveway. Outside the perimeter, the air was thick with the roar of a mob. Protesters brandished signs painted in jagged red letters. Monsters in our backyard and save Kalen RUI. To the public, this wasn't a rehabilitation house. It was a slaughterhouse waiting to happen. Judge Seraphine Holt stepped out of the black sedan first, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the flashing bulbs of the press. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the governor's representatives waiting to hand her a cease and desist order. She only reached back into the car and took Kalen's small, cold hand in hers. "Don't look at them, Kalen," she whispered, her voice a low anchor in the storm of shouting. "Look at the door. Just the door." Inside the foyer, the air was unnervingly still, smelling of floor wax and old stone. Waiting in a semicircle were the 6 men and women who had been traded from concrete cells for this gilded cage. They stood under the watchful eyes of 4 armed tactical guards, but the real weight in the room came from the convicts themselves. There was Elian, the disgraced legal prodigy with eyes like a hawk, already calculating the structural weaknesses of the room. Nkem, the silent giant whose hands were scarred from a lifetime of enforcement, he claimed he never did. Maritza, a woman whose beauty was as sharp as the shiv she was rumored to hide, and Tavien, the art forger who looked more like a bored academic than a federal thief. And, standing slightly apart from the rest, Malric Vane. Malric didn't look like a teacher anymore. In the harsh LED light of the foyer, the shadows in the hollows of his cheeks made him look like a ghost inhabiting a living man's body. His orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by a simple charcoal shirt, but the death row aura clung to him like a second skin. "The terms are simple," Seraphine announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Her eyes swept over the criminals, lingering a fraction of a second too long on Malric. "You are here because the state has deemed you beyond saving. I disagree. For the next 90 days, your lives belong to this child. You will cook for him, you will protect him, and you will show the world that even a monster can be a shield. If one of you fails, if a single hair on his head is harmed, you all return to maximum security. And Malric, your date with the needle will be moved forward to Monday." A ripple of tension went through the line. Tavien let out a dry, nervous chuckle. "So we're babysitters for a get-out-of-jail-free card? Judge, with all due respect, this kid looks like he's seen more ghosts than we have." Kalen shrank against Seraphine's leg, his knuckles white as he gripped her robe. He looked at the vast, empty hallway of the manor, then back at the 6 strangers who represented the very worst of humanity. To Kalen, they weren't just criminals. They were the shadows that lived under his bed, brought into the light by the grandmother who couldn't claim him. Seraphine knelt, placing her hands on Kalen's shoulders. This was the gamble. She was placing her flesh and blood into a den of wolves, betting everything that the monsters were the only ones who knew how to fight the devil who had killed her daughter. "Go on, Kalen," she urged, her voice trembling with a suppressed sob. "Pick a room. This is your house now." The boy didn't move. He looked at the guards with their heavy rifles. He looked at the elegant Maritza, who offered a practiced, empty smile. Then, his eyes locked onto Malric's. For a long, breathless minute, the two of them, the broken boy and the condemned man, simply stared. Malric didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. He simply stepped back, clearing a path toward the grand staircase, his expression unreadable but his stance positioned instinctively between the boy and the shouting mob outside the windows. Kalen took a tentative step forward, his sneakers squeaking on the marble. The monster house was officially open, and as the heavy front doors were bolted shut from the outside, the real trial began. By day 3, the air inside Redgate Manor had curdled with the scent of failed attempts and desperate posturing. The monsters were learning that a silent child is a mirror that reflects only your own inadequacies. Maritza, the woman who had once charmed her way into the vaults of European banks, tried first. She presented a plate of handmade pasta, the aroma of garlic and basil filling the kitchen like a peace offering. "Eat, little bird," she cooed, her voice a practiced melody of false warmth. Kalen didn't even blink. He stared through the steam of the food as if it were poison. His small body pressed so tightly into the corner of the velvet sofa that he seemed to be trying to merge with the fabric. Next came Cormac, the forger. He spread a dozen vibrant charcoal sketches across the coffee table, whimsical dragons and soaring birds that looked ready to breathe. "I can teach you to make these, kid," Cormac whispered, sliding a pencil toward the boy's hand. "We can draw a way out of here." Kaelin's gaze remained fixed on the floor, his fingers curled into tight, bloodless fists. He wasn't looking for art. He was looking for a bulkhead. The guards watched from the shadows, hands hovering near their holsters, waiting for the inevitable snap. The tension was a living thing, a wire pulled until it hummed. Malric Vane hadn't moved from his armchair in the corner. He hadn't offered a bribe or a smile. He sat with his large, scarred hands resting on his knees, his gaze settled on a point just above the fireplace. He looked like a man who had already accepted his execution, a mountain of granite that expected nothing from the world. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of Kaelin's sneakers hitting the hardwood. The boy didn't walk toward the food or the art. He moved with a haunting, single-minded focus toward the darkest corner of the room. Maritza gasped. Cormac reached out a hand to stop him, but pulled back when he saw the look in Kaelin's eyes. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Kaelin stopped at Malric's knees. For a long, agonizing heartbeat, the hulking convict and the fragile orphan were locked in a silent dialogue of broken souls. Then, slowly, the boy climbed. He hoisted himself up, his small frame disappearing into the shadow of Malric's chest. He didn't just sit, he burrowed, pressing his ear directly over Malric's heart, as if listening for a rhythm he finally recognized. Malric's breath hitched. His massive arms trembled, hovering in the air as if he feared his touch might shatter the child. But as Kaelin's tension finally bled away, Malric closed his eyes and let his arms settle around the boy like a fortress. In the sudden, profound stillness of the room, a sound emerged. It was small, cracked from months of disuse, but it cut through the air like a thunderclap. "Safe," Kaelin whispered into the charcoal fabric of the inmate's shirt. The word hit the room with the force of a physical blow. The monsters stood frozen. Malric's eyes flew open, shimmering with a sudden, terrifying wetness. He looked up at the security cameras, at the guards, at the world that wanted him dead, and for the first time in a decade, the devil of Cell Block C looked like a man who had found a reason to fight back. The red light of the security monitor pulsed in the darkness of Seraphine's private study like a slow, bleeding heartbeat. On the screen, the grainy image of Malric Vane holding the sleeping boy was frozen. Seraphine reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced the outline of Kaelin's small face on the glass. "Safe," she whispered to the empty room, the word tasting like salt and regret. She closed her eyes, and the sterile walls of the manor dissolved into the memory of a rainy Tuesday 18 months ago. It was the last time she had seen her daughter, Elena. They were in a cramped, sunlit kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and cheap floor cleaner, a world away from the mahogany and marble of the High Court. "You can't keep living like this, Elena," Seraphine had said, her voice sharpened by the very authority she used to sentence men to life. "Strake is dangerous. I've seen his files. He doesn't just arrest people. He erases them. Come home. Bring Kaelin. I can protect you both." Elena had looked up from the table, her eyes weary but glowing with a fierce, maternal fire that Seraphine had never quite understood until that moment. She was a public defender who had dug too deep into the precinct's ledgers, finding the rot that Detective Dorian Strake had spent a career concealing. "If I come to you, Mom, he'll know I've talked," Elena had replied, clutching a manila folder to her chest as if it were a shield. "He's already watching the house. But I have a witness. Someone Strake thinks he's already broken." A man named Malric Vane. Seraphine had scoffed then. A criminal? You're trusting your life to a man like that. He's not what they say he is, Elena insisted, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. He was the only one who tried to stop them. If something happens to me, if I can't get this to the federal board, promise me you won't let the system take Kaylin. Promise me you'll find the only person who actually knows the truth. 3 nights later, the call had come. A botched robbery. A silent child found huddled in a closet, his eyes wide and fixed on the red and blue lights reflecting off the blood on the floor. Detective Strake had been the first on the scene, his boots clicking rhythmically against the hardwood as he carried the boy out. He had looked Seraphine in the eye at the funeral, offering his deepest condolences, while his hand rested on his holster, a silent, chilling reminder that he knew exactly what Elena had been hiding. Seraphine had spent a year playing the part of the impartial judge, watching from the bench as Strake systematically dismantled Elena's reputation and buried the evidence. She had watched him frame Malric Vane for a crime that occurred while the man was already in a holding cell. The law she had served for 30 years was being used as a shroud to cover her daughter's murder. She opened her eyes and looked back at the monitor. The monster house wasn't a rehabilitation project. It was a Trojan horse. She had handpicked these 6 outcasts because they were the only people Strake couldn't buy, intimidate, or ignore. They were the jagged pieces of a puzzle she was forcing together with the sheer weight of her gavel. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a grandmother who had crossed the line between justice and vengeance. If Malric Vane was the monster the world feared, then Seraphine Holt was the architect who had built his cage, and she was about to hand him the key. "Forgive me, Elena," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the drawer where she kept the unauthorized files on Strake's payroll. "I'm not bringing him home to a family. I'm bringing the family to the fight." The midnight air in the manor library was thick with the scent of old parchment and the lingering, metallic chill of the security gate. Kaylin hadn't slept. The shadows in the corners of his bedroom were too sharp, too reminiscent of the night the world went dark. He had wandered the halls like a ghost until he found the only light still burning, a low amber glow from a single desk lamp in the center of the library. Malric Vane sat in a high-backed leather chair, a massive, ancient volume resting on his knees. He didn't look up when the boy's small feet padded across the Persian rug. He didn't startle when Kaylin climbed back into his lap, settling into the familiar hollow of his chest. Malric simply adjusted his arm, his callous thumb brushing against the boy's shoulder as he continued to read in a voice that was a low, resonant rumble, a sound like tectonic plates shifting deep underground. "In the forest of the night," Malric read, his voice devoid of the harshness he used with the guards, "there was a lion who had lost his roar. Not because he was weak, but because the forest was too loud with the sounds of hunters." He wasn't reading a legal brief or a prison manual. He was reading a tattered collection of fables he had salvaged from the manor's dusty shelves. Before the headlines called him a butcher, Malric had spent his days in a classroom, teaching high schoolers how to find their souls in the margins of poetry. The system had tried to strip that man away, but as Kaylin leaned closer, Malric felt the old rhythms returning. "The hunters had a name," Malric continued, his finger tracing the lines of the text so Kaylin could follow. "They were called the Shadows. And they thought that if they took the lion's roar, they took his power." Kaylin's breath hitched. His small finger reached out, trembling, and touched the word shadows. He looked up at Malric, his eyes wide with a question he couldn't form. "They were wrong," Malric whispered, closing the book halfway but keeping his place. The lion wasn't silent because he was afraid. He was silent because he was waiting. He was gathering the words he needed to tell the truth. Do you know what happens when the lion finally speaks, Kaylin? The boy shook his head, his face pressed against Malrik's collarbone. The forest listens. And the hunters realize they aren't the kings they thought they were. Malrik pulled a small leather-bound journal from the side table, one Seraphine had left for the boy. He opened it to a blank page and handed Kaylin a charcoal pencil. "We don't have to roar yet," Malrik said softly. "But we can start naming the hunters. If you can't say it, draw it. Let the paper hold the fear so you don't have to." Kaylin took the pencil. For a long time, he just stared at the white expanse of the page. Then, with a sudden frantic energy, he began to draw. He didn't draw lions or forests. He drew a man with a star on his chest and a face made of smoke. He drew a car with broken glass that looked like jagged teeth. As the charcoal scratched against the paper, Malrik watched with a growing cold clarity. He recognized the silhouette of the man in the drawing. He recognized the star, not a celestial body, but a badge. "The man with the star," Malrik murmured, his eyes darkening with a lethal focus. "He's the one who took the roar, isn't he?" Kaylin nodded once, a sharp, jagged motion. He gripped Malrik's shirt, his knuckles white. The silence in the library was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of a shared secret. Malrik didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a witness. And as he looked down at the boy who had chosen a condemned man as his shield, Malrik realized that his life wasn't over. He had been given 90 days to teach one final lesson: how to bring a monster to justice. The breakfast table at Redgate Manor was a theater of forced normalcy, the clinking of silverware against porcelain providing a rhythmic mask for the tension that sat like a weight in the room. Maritza was staring into her coffee, and Kem was methodically tearing a piece of toast into perfect, identical squares. But it was Cormac, the forger, who was truly restless. His eyes, sharpened by decades of discerning the microscopic difference between a genuine Picasso and a masterpiece of his own creation, kept darting to the crumpled sketchbook tucked under Kaylin's arm. Kaylin sat in his usual spot, fused to Malrik's side. The boy was no longer catatonic, but he was far from whole. He looked at the world with a wary, calculating gaze of a veteran who had seen the front lines and expected the mortars to start falling at any second. "The kid's got a steady hand," Cormac remarked, his voice light but his eyes like flint. He leaned across the table, his long, artistic fingers twitching. "Mind if I see the latest, little man? I might have some tips on shading." Kaylin hesitated, looking up at Malrik. The former teacher gave a slow, encouraging nod. With a hand that still trembled slightly, the boy slid the sketchbook across the mahogany surface toward Cormac. The forger didn't just look at the drawings. He inhaled them. He flipped through the pages with a practiced, clinical speed, his brow furrowing deeper with every turn. He stopped at the drawing from the night before, the man with the star on his chest and the face made of smoke. But it wasn't the face that held Cormac's attention. It was the way the figure was standing. The tilt of the shoulders. The specific, diagonal slant of the lines representing the man's stride. "Wait a minute," Cormac whispered, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket, a contraband item he'd managed to secrete into the house, and pressed it against the paper. "What is it, Cormac?" Maritza asked, her voice dropping its melodic lilt. It's a kid's drawing. It's trauma on paper. No, Cormac snapped, his eyes wide and feverish. It's a signature. Look at the weight on the left foot. Look at the way he draws the hand on the holster. It's tucked in, thumb hooked over the leather. Most people draw a generic cop. This kid isn't drawing a memory. He's drawing a kinetic pattern. He's drawing a man with a distinct, neurological hitch in his walk. Cormac looked up, his face pale under the kitchen lights. I spent 20 years studying how people move their hands so I could mimic their handwriting. I know a tell when I see one. This isn't just a badge, Malric. This is Detective Dorian Strake. The way he stands, the way he leans when he's about to exert authority. It's all here. The kid didn't just see the murder. He witnessed the professional signature of a man who thinks he's invisible. The room went cold. Nkem stopped tearing his bread. Even the guards at the door seemed to stiffen, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Cormac, Malric said, his voice a low, warning growl. Are you sure? I'd bet my hands on it, the forger replied, sliding the book back to Kaelin with a newfound reverence. This isn't just art, kid. This is a map. You've been drawing the crime scene from angles the police reports never mentioned. You saw him move the body, didn't you? Kaelin didn't answer with words. He simply picked up the charcoal pencil and added a small, jagged detail to the man's hand, a ring with a specific, square stone. Cormac let out a jagged breath. The graduation ring from the academy. Strake wears it on his left hand. The kid's a human camera. Malric's hand tightened on the back of Kaelin's chair. The monsters of Redgate Manor were no longer just prisoners waiting out a clock. They were a forensic unit with nothing left to lose. They had the witness, they had the evidence, and for the first time in their lives, they had a reason to use their illicit talents for something other than survival. Hide the book, Malric commanded, his eyes meeting Cormac's in a silent pact. From here on out, we don't just protect the boy. We build the case. The blue light of a dozen monitors washed over Detective Dorian Strake's face, casting his features into a jagged, skeletal mask. He sat in the darkened precinct annex, leaning forward as he replayed the intercepted audio from the Redgate Manor kitchen. He heard Cormac's voice, he's a human camera, and the sound of his own breathing hitched. Strake's left hand, the one adorned with the heavy gold academy ring, instinctively clenched. He had spent 18 months convinced that a traumatized 5-year-old was a broken hard drive, his memory wiped by the sheer force of the horror he'd witnessed. He hadn't counted on a group of career criminals knowing how to recover the data. You think you're playing a game, Seraphine, Strake whispered to the empty room, his eyes fixed on the image of Malric Vane shielding the boy. But I own the board. By dawn, the first cracks in the Monster House experiment didn't come from inside the walls, but from the world outside. Strake didn't need a warrant to destroy a reputation. He only needed a phone. By 8 a.m., a leaked, anonymous tip had hit the major news cycles, accompanied by grainy, doctored footage of Malric Vane looming over Kaelin. The headline screamed, "Abuse in the Manor? Judge's experiment spirals as death row inmate terrifies silent orphan." Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted from investigative focus to sudden, sharp paranoia. The afternoon supply delivery arrived, a routine drop-off of groceries and medical supplies, but as Nkem began to unpack the crates, his massive hands froze. Tucked deep inside a carton of powdered milk was a small vacuum-sealed bag of white powder. "Don't touch it," Elian barked, his legal mind sensing the trap before Nkem's fingers could even graze the plastic. It's a plant. Strake is moving. But it was too late. The front doors burst open with a rhythmic, heavy thud. It wasn't a tactical team yet, but a mandatory health and safety inspection, led by a subordinate Strake had handpicked. They swarmed the kitchen, cameras flashing, their boots tracking mud across the marble floors. We received a tip regarding the distribution of controlled substances within the facility, the lead officer announced, his voice a flat, rehearsed monotone. He walked straight to the pantry, his hand reaching for the exact spot where Nkem had found the bag. It's a setup, Maritza hissed, her eyes darting toward the security cameras. Check the logs. That crate was tampered with. The logs are undergoing maintenance, ma'am, the officer replied with a thin, cruel smile. In the library, Malric pulled Kaelin into the shadows of the bookshelves, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear the chaos in the kitchen, the shouting, the sound of furniture being overturned, the frantic protests of his fellow outcasts. He looked down at Kaelin, who was trembling so violently that his teeth were chattering. The boy clutched his sketchbook to his chest, his eyes wide with a familiar, suffocating terror. He's coming for the book, Malric, Kaelin whispered, his voice barely a breath. It was the first full sentence he had spoken, and it sent a chill down Malric's spine. He won't get it, Malric promised, though the weight of his own death sentence felt heavier than ever. He knew how this worked. Strake would use the planted drugs to justify a full tactical raid. He would claim the monsters had turned on each other, and in the confusion, a tragic accident would happen. The witness would be silenced, the forger's evidence destroyed, and Malric would be sent back to the Needle. Through the library window, Malric saw the black SUVs screaming up the driveway, their sirens silent but their intent deafening. Strake was no longer lurking in the shadows. He was coming to burn the house down. The air in the grand hallway of Redgate Manor had turned electric, charged with the ozone of an impending storm. Through the reinforced windows, the flashing blue lights of the safety inspection vehicles were being joined by the heavy, matte black silhouettes of tactical SUVs. Detective Strake wasn't just coming to audit a rehabilitation program. He was coming to amputate a threat. Inside, the 6 monsters stood in the center of the foyer, a fractured line of defense. Elian, the legal prodigy, was staring at the front door as if he could read the warrant through the wood. Maritza's hands were steady, but her eyes were wild, darting toward the vents she knew she could crawl through if she chose to run. Nkem loomed like a gargoyle, his massive chest heaving with a silent, simmering rage. They're going to kill him, Tavian whispered, his voice cracking. He wasn't looking at the door, he was looking at Malric, who stood at the top of the stairs, shielding Kaelin behind his massive frame. They'll say Malric resisted. They'll say the kid was caught in the crossfire. And then they'll burn the sketchbook. Not today, Maritza said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its flirtatious edge. She turned to face the group, her gaze hardening into something sharper than any shiv. We've spent our lives cutting each other's throats for a bigger slice of nothing. But that boy called this place safe. He called us safe. She's right, Cormac added, stepping forward. He pulled a heavy silver letter opener from a side table. Not a weapon, but a tool. I spent 20 years forging legacies for people who didn't deserve them. For once, I'd like to protect a truth that actually matters. A silent understanding passed between them, the kind of pact forged only in foxholes and prison yards. They weren't just a collection of criminals anymore. They were a specialized unit. Elian grabbed a tablet, his fingers flying across the screen as he began a frantic, illegal bypass of the manor's local server, attempting to broadcast the internal security footage to an external cloud before Strake's men could wipe the drives. "Nkem, the heavy furniture," Elian barked, his voice regaining the authority of the courtroom. "Barricade the kitchen entry. If they come through the back, we need 30 seconds of noise. Maritza, Tavian, get the child to the panic room in the basement. Cormac, I need you to copy those drawings. Every page. If they take the original, we need a ghost." "What about Malric?" Nkem asked, his voice a low rumble as he hoisted a mahogany sideboard as if it were made of balsa wood. "Malric stays with the boy," Maritza said, looking up the stairs. "He's the only one Kaelin trusts. If the world sees a monster protecting a child while the heroes are kicking in the door, the narrative flips. That's our only play." Malric looked down at them, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. He saw the art forger, the thief, the enforcer, and the disgraced lawyer, people the world had thrown away, standing as a human wall for a child they had only known for 3 days. It was a beautiful, desperate kind of madness. "Thank you," Malric mouthed. "Don't thank us yet," Elian replied, not looking up from his screen. "We're about to commit enough felonies to keep us in solitary until the sun burns out. But if we're going back to the cage, we're going back for doing something right for the first time in our miserable lives." The sound of a battering ram echoed through the house, a heavy metallic thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. The front door groaned, the hinges screaming under the pressure. "Positions," Maritza hissed. As the first flashbang grenade shattered a window, the monsters of Redgate Manor didn't scatter. They moved toward the heat. For the first time, they weren't fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting for the boy who had seen the truth in their shadows. The world turned into a nightmare of strobe lights and shattering glass. The front doors of Redgate Manor didn't just open, they disintegrated under the force of a breaching charge, the shockwave snuffing out the amber glow of the library lamps. Through the billowing drywall dust, silhouettes in tactical gear flooded the foyer, their laser sights dancing like hungry red fireflies across the walls. "Drop the boy. Drop him now," a voice roared over the screech of a siren. Malric didn't drop him. He dropped to his knees, wrapping his massive frame around Kaelin like a living shield. He felt the boy's small fingers digging into his charcoal shirt, felt the frantic rabbit thump of a heart that had already survived too many raids. In the chaos, Malric saw Nkem shoved against a marble pillar, saw Maritza pinned to the floor by 2 officers, and saw Elian's tablet, the one holding the digital truth, smashed beneath a heavy black boot. Then, the sea of tactical gear parted. Detective Dorian Strake stepped into the light, his gold academy ring glinting as he adjusted his gloves. He didn't look like a man conducting a rescue. He looked like a hunter reclaiming his kill. "Malric Vane," Strake said, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. "You're under arrest for the kidnapping and endangerment of a minor. We have the witness statements. We have the evidence you forced this child to draw under duress." "He's lying," Elian screamed from the floor, his face pressed into the rug. "The boy chose him. We have the footage." Strake didn't even look at him. He nodded to the officers flanking Malric. "Secure the victim. If the suspect resists, you have authorization to use lethal force. He's a death row inmate with nothing to lose. He was trying to use the kid as a human shield to force a breakout." The hands that tore Kaelin away from Malric were cold and efficient. The boy didn't scream, He couldn't, but the sound he made was worse. It was a jagged, airless gasp, his eyes locking onto Malric's with a look of such profound betrayal that it felt like a physical spike through Malric's chest. Kalen reached out, his small fingers brushing Malric's for a fleeting second before he was hoisted away, his sketchbook falling to the floor and sliding into the shadows. "Kalen!" Malric roared, his first display of the monster the world expected. He surged forward, but the butt of a rifle slammed into his ribs, folding him in half. The handcuffs didn't just click, they bit into his wrists, followed by heavy leg irons that dragged against the floor with a rhythmic, funeral toll. Strake leaned down, his face inches from Malric's. "You were supposed to die quietly in a cell, teacher," Strake whispered, so low only Malric could hear. "But now the world is going to watch you crawl back to the needle as a child stealer. And the boy. Don't worry about the boy. I'll make sure he forgets everything he saw in that closet." As Malric was dragged toward the door, his boots scuffing through the broken glass of the house that had briefly been a sanctuary, he looked back. He saw the monsters being loaded into separate vans, their faces bruised but their eyes fixed on him. He saw Kalen being bundled into the back of Strake's sedan, the child's face pressed against the glass, small palms flat against the window. The rain began to fall, washing the dust from the driveway but doing nothing to clean the stench of the setup. Malric was shoved into the back of a steel-caged transport, the heavy door slamming shut with a sound of absolute finality. The mission had failed. The unified front was broken. As the van lurched forward, Malric sat in the darkness, the weight of the chains a heavy reminder that in this city, the man with the badge was the only monster that mattered. The courtroom was a cathedral of judgment, cold and suffocating under the weight of 1,000 eyes. Outside, the city was screaming for Malric Vane's head, fueled by the doctored footage Strake had leaked to every news outlet. Inside, Malric sat in a cage of bulletproof glass, his orange jumpsuit a neon sign of his supposed guilt. But as Judge Seraphine Holt took her seat at the bench, her face was a mask of marble, her eyes fixed not on the defendant, but on the row of 5 monsters sitting in the witness box. The prosecution moved with the confidence of a predator. "These are career criminals," the state attorney declared, gesturing to the line of convicts. "Liars, forgers, and enforcers who used a traumatized orphan as a pawn in a sick game of freedom." Then, Elian stood up. He wasn't in shackles. He was in a suit Seraphine had surreptitiously provided, and for the first time in years, the disgraced legal prodigy looked like the man who had once terrified the Bar Association. "The state speaks of pawns," Elian's voice rang out, cutting through the murmurs like a gavel. "But let's talk about the architect. Detective Dorian Strake didn't raid that house to save a child. He raided it to execute a witness." The gallery erupted, but Elian didn't flinch. One by one, the outcasts stepped forward, turning their own histories of crime into a scalpel. Cormac the forger didn't talk about his own thefts. He produced a high-resolution scan of Kalen's drawings, the ghost copies he had made minutes before the raid. He pointed to the specific neurological tell in the killer's gait that matched Strake's own medical records. Maritza spoke of the planted drugs, her voice steady as she described the exact shipping manifest Strake had altered. But the killing blow didn't come from a criminal. It came from the bench. "Detective Strake," Seraphine interrupted, her voice dropping into a register that made the entire room go silent. "You've spent 18 months claiming my daughter's murder was a random act of violence. You've spent 18 months trying to convince me that my grandson was safer in the hands of the state than with the man who actually protected him." The word grandson hit the room like a physical shock. The lead prosecutor froze. Strake, sitting in the front row, felt the air leave his lungs. "Your grandson," the prosecutor stammered. "Your Honor, you are hopelessly conflicted. This entire experiment was a personal vendetta." "It was a search for the truth," Seraphine countered, leaning forward until she was inches from the microphone. "A truth that 6 monsters were willing to sacrifice their lives for, while the men in blue were busy planting evidence. I am not here to preside over Malric Vane's execution. I am here to witness the testimony of the only people in this city who didn't blink when they saw the devil wearing a badge." Nkem stood up last. He didn't speak. He simply held up a small blood-stained digital drive he had swallowed and later retrieved, the only piece of the Manor's security footage Strake's men hadn't found. It flickered to life on the courtroom monitors, showing the raid in brutal, unedited detail. It showed Strake leaning over a bound Malric, whispering the confession the forger's microphones had captured. As the audio of Strake's voice filled the room, "The boy will forget everything he saw in that closet." The silence was absolute. Malric looked through the glass at Seraphine. He saw the grandmother who had risked her soul to save her blood. He saw the monsters who had traded their chance at a plea deal to tell a story the world tried to bury. And in the back of the room, he saw Kalen, held by a court advocate, his small hand raised in a wave that only Malric could see. The scales of justice didn't just tip, they shattered. The gavel didn't strike with the sound of a hollow wooden block. It struck like the closing of a tomb for Dorian Strake. The courtroom was a blur of motion as state marshals moved in, their faces grim, to strip the badge from Strake's chest and replace it with the cold, biting steel of handcuffs. The man who had ruled the city through shadows was led away in a silence so profound it felt heavier than any shout. But Malric Vane didn't watch him leave. His eyes were fixed on the glass partition of his prisoner's box as the electronic lock hissed and disengaged. For the first time in a decade, the devil of Cell Block C stepped into a room without the rattle of chains. He felt the air, real unfiltered air, hit his face, and his knees nearly buckled under the weight of a freedom he had long ago traded for a burial plot. Judge Seraphine Holt descended from the bench. She didn't look like a high-ranking official anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally put down a crushing burden. She walked past the stunned prosecutors and the retreating cameras, stopping only when she reached Malric. Behind her, the other 5 monsters, Maritza, Nkem, Elian, Tavian, and Cormac, stood in a loose, protective semicircle. They were battered, their own legal futures still a tangled web of plea deals and probation, but they stood tall. They had walked through the fire to save a child, and in doing so, they had scorched away the labels the world had pinned to their chests. "He's waiting for you, Malric," Seraphine whispered, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "Take him home. To a real home." 6 weeks later, the rain was no longer a cold forensic gray. It was a soft spring mist that clung to the budding trees of a quiet suburban street. The house was small, a modest cottage with a wide front porch and a yard that didn't have a single security camera or barbed wire fence. It was the kind of place a former teacher could afford on a quiet pension, far from the neon rot of the city. Malric stood in the living room, surrounded by boxes that didn't contain evidence files or prison rations. There were books, thousands of them, and a new set of charcoal pencils that Cormac had insisted on buying. From the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and warm bread wafted through the air, a recipe Maritza had spent 3 hours explaining over the phone. Kalen was sitting on a rug by the window, his sketchbook open. He wasn't drawing men with smoke faces or stars on their chests anymore. He was drawing the garden outside, his hand steady and his eyes bright with a curiosity that had finally replaced the hollow vacancy of trauma. "Malric," the boy said, his voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, resonant sound that filled the corners of the room. Malric turned, a slow smile breaking across a face that had forgotten how to hold one. "Yeah, Kalen. Are we staying?" Malric walked over and knelt beside him, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked at the scars on his own wrists, then at the peaceful light reflecting in Kalen's eyes. The world might always see a monster when they looked at him, but in this house, under this roof, he was simply the man who had stayed. "We're staying," Malric promised, his voice thick with a hard-won peace. "The gates are open, Kalen. And they're never closing again." Kalen nodded, leaned his head against Malric's arm, and went back to his drawing. In the quiet of their first true home, the lion and the boy finally found the only thing the law couldn't give them: a future. This story serves as a poignant exploration of the blurred lines between legality and morality. At its core, the narrative challenges our perceptions of who is truly dangerous and who is noble. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is that the law and justice are not always the same thing. It took an illegal experiment, a secret grandmother, and a group of felons to achieve what the legal system failed to do for 18 months. The story concludes that true justice often requires a person to step outside the safety of the rules to do what is right. Like this video if the moment the monsters sacrificed their own freedom to protect little Kalen's future broke your heart. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that true justice isn't found in the cold letter of the law, but in the warmth of a person's character. Drop a comment telling me, if you were in Kalen's shoes, would you have chosen the safety of a state institution or the lap of the man the world called a monster? Your perspectives on what truly makes a person a guardian will determine how we explore the next chapter of the Rouet legacy. Thank you for watching Afroseoul Love Diaries. Remember, for Kalen and Malric, this wasn't just the end of an experiment. It was the beginning of a new law for their family. A law where the system might give you a house, but only a shared soul can build a home. Subscribe to this channel right now, because while the monster house is officially closed, the world is just starting to see what happens when a death row inmate finally takes the role of a father.